So the question is, can we extend the homework 5 deadline? Probably going to be a no, but I at least want to hear you out.
Because the project's due next week and there's nothing else due. So if we're done with the project, then I could use the time to do the homework.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Because that sounds like something that's going to be specific to you and your team, that you did the project ahead of time before homework 5. If I extend the homework 5 deadline, the teams who haven't done the project yet, that's going to start interfering with that. They're going to, if I move homework 5 to here, well, now a lot of students, I know how students are, they're going to wait until that deadline to work on it, not think about the project yet, and then they only have a few days to do the project. So I don't want the deadlines interfering with each other too much. I'm kind of okay with homework 4 and 5 being close together, because if you got through homework 4, if you get through homework 4 by tonight, I don't think it's going to take you that long to do homework 5. Homework 5 is a pretty good step down in difficulty, in my opinion, of course, than homework 4. So having just a few days to do that one, I think that's the one that can take the shorter time span. Yes.
Sorry, I wasn't here Friday because I was sick. Was there anything announced that I couldn't get from like the lecture notes, quiz, something like that?
No, I recorded everything from Friday.
Okay, so I should watch that.
Yeah, it was only one time that I had something live that I didn't record. And that was only because I put a list of U-bits on the screen. If it's not a privacy issue, I'll record everything, release the videos.
Thank you. And there isn't the quiz date, there isn't a quiz for this one, so I'm sorry, my brain.
A quiz? There are no quizzes in this course.
Right.
No quizzes, no exams. Oi. All right, any other open questions while we're at it?
Just a question on number 4. At the end of a post request, after, so you select the image, is there a carriage return or no?
After the image, is there a carriage return? Was that a? I'm not 100% off the top of my head. I want to say yes, that there's a /r/n carriage return line fee. Or else you would see that boundary way off the edge of the line at the end of the image. There's got to be one there. Trying to think back to my parsing in the spec. Yeah, find the boundary and take everything. Yeah, I think I did overlook that when I was talking in lecture. That there's that new line at the end.
Yeah, because I found that there's use find and then there's R find, which is the last iteration of something in Python.
Right. I think my code actually preserve it, to be honest. So I might be taking that new line into my image. Looks like it didn't break anything. My image is displayed fine. You'll just have a few extra bytes, two new extra bytes of the PNG encoding. That's on my I'll have to fix in my code, to be honest. What's that? It shouldn't. In fact, during some of my testing, I was trying things. If you have the content length wrong when you're reading an image and you only read half of it, you'll just have half an image, but it'll still render.
Doesn't that depend on the compression too? Like
For PNG specifically.
PNG.
Yep.
Because I get an image that's about the right size, but
For JPEGs? Yeah.
so
Yeah, it depends on the encoding. PNG though, I was getting partial images. I could play around with the bytes. So I'll just have like an extra pixel at the end if I have that new line character. It actually explains something I saw in my code. Any other open questions? Yeah.
If I
Well, splitting,
Like, I'm writing a file that's got a name, but
so,
rough.
so the homework's, so we'll, Nick and I look into those cases, and we can give you the 2 if it's close. If there's just something that you missed there. The 2 is you're almost there, but there's just some issue with it. We can give you that. If it's not fully working, unless it's something really silly that we find, it won't be the 3, but you can still get the 2 if it's really close like that, and there's just one little mistake. For the separate parts, so say you are getting file uploads, but you can't download them, since those are separate objectives, you can still get the points for objective 2 for the uploads, but make sure in your documentation you have the way to test that. Okay, when you upload, expect in this directory there to be a new file named image1. You can open that and see the image. If you get all the way through the assignment, your testing doc can be a little easier. Just go to the page, it all works. I mean, obviously a little more detail than that. But if you don't get all the way to 4, just make sure you explain the testing procedures of how to test those partial objectives.
I got it. It's just subjective to
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, we have to revisit my wording. Are you asking, could we give you credit on part 3 even though you don't part 2 finish? Yeah, so
It's just like yes or no. Did it or you didn't for each objective.
I mean, we grade on the same scale of the self-reported grading. The 1 if you just barely have an attempt, 2 if you're close but there's something wrong, and then 3 if it's correct. So we give you the 2s and go with that one.
If the image uploading from objective 2 isn't working, could we possibly get full points for objective 4 if we demonstrate use of templates for some other purpose?
I have to think about that one. It'll depend on the wording that I have in the document, at least partially on the wording, and I'll look into that when grading time comes. I'll say potentially.
Because we're supposed to make a page that shows all the images that were uploaded.
Yeah, so by the wording, technically no, but I'll see what I can squeeze out of there for partial credit.
But you could still like load up that directory, like say like, okay, this part's not working, just add some images and they'll appear on this page. Or the
Yeah,
names
that
will
one.
corrupt it. Like, that's still-
So if that's the case, in your testing procedures, say, look, in my submission, I provided a directory of images as though they were uploaded. You can use that to test objective 4 using these steps. Yeah, I'll go with that one. Yeah, Wednesday and Friday will be Docker. Today, I'll talk about web frameworks. Any other open questions while we're on a roll here? Let's talk about the project. So I mentioned last time that I have the phase 1 doc up, but I forgot to upload it to the website. So it wasn't quite up until, I think, later that day, before that night. But let's talk about phase 1. So there's no homework attached to this week. This week is attached to project phase 1. So let's talk about the project all this week, just getting you ready for that phase 1 submission. So let's take a look at what's in here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but let's just do a quick overview. GitHub, and I want to talk about expectations. GitHub repository, I do expect that you all know Git and GitHub. I'm not going to cover that in this course. That was a 116 topic. Yes, I know most of you cheese it in 116, but it is content. It was covered. You were supposed to use it. If you did cheese it in 116, that's on you. You gotta read up on GitHub, learn how to use that stuff. Actually, I don't think we covered GitHub. I wouldn't mind talking about that a bit. But Git, I'm not going to cover it in lecture. If you want to come to office hours, I'd be more than happy to help out. I'm just not going to use up lecture time on it, is what I mean by that. But if you're struggling with Git, come see us in office hours. GitHub, I guess this hasn't technically been covered. So GitHub is a website where you can upload your Git projects, your Git repositories. GitHub doesn't do a lot for you in terms of features and functionality. Oh, that's a bad statement. I want to backtrack that one. What the big thing that GitHub is doing for us is letting us use their servers, so you can host your Git repository on their servers. And yeah, they do add features. I got to backtrack that one. They do add quite a bit of nice features, graphs, and analysis tools, and just a nice GUI to be able to interact with your repo. But the big reason, the initial reason why to use GitHub is they let us use their server space for free even, so let's take advantage of that. So uploading to GitHub, that's going to be how you submit your projects, work on GitHub, and I do recommend that you use either GitHub issues or some other task tracking, Trello, ZenHub, any other task tracking software. In your team report form, you have to say what you're planning to do before the next meeting. I'm sure by now you've all filled it out. But there's also a space for links to those tasks. It's not explicitly required, and I'm not taking points off if you don't have those links, but it can very much so clarify what it is you're actually doing. So if you don't have, for one, if you just don't want to be spending a lot of time filling out these forms, but you do want to fill out a lot of time specifying your tasks in GitHub issues, fill out the tasks in GitHub issues, say, I'm going to work on issues number this, this, and this, here's the links, and it can simplify filling out that form while still tracking your tasks, but tracking them in a way that the rest of your team can clearly see what everybody at least thinks they're supposed to be working on, and then if there's an issue in there, then you can talk about it like, hey, I thought I was doing that part. I don't know, there are a lot of advantages. I'm not going to sell task tracking to you, but I highly recommend using that and then submitting the links. And then when I am reviewing for individual effort, if you have those links and those tasks, and I can go to that task, if I'm looking back for last week's meeting during phase 1 grading, and I can click on those links and see that you've completed that task and see the exact commit that you submitted the code to complete that task, that's going to be a lot easier to be able to be able to tell what happened on this project than if it's just an English blurb. I'm going to do this by next week, and then I have to try to tease that out of the project. And then if that's the case, if I can't really tell where your work is, I have to rely on other means to try to find what you did, looking at your commits or something. And if your project management, your just organizational skills aren't there, I might not find your contributions. It happens quite a bit. In 442 specifically, I've done this a lot, looking through projects, trying to figure out who did what. GitHub doesn't always, there's a lot of ways that your code, your contributions can be lost in GitHub. For one, I never had you tell me your GitHub name. So first I have to track a GitHub account, trace that back to you, and figure out who you are. If you have one link to one issue ever, well, now I have your GitHub name. That's easy. If you don't have your account linked to your laptop in a clean way, sometimes it takes your email as your username, and then you have these commits that are not attached to your GitHub account, and I can't really attach them to you at all. And if I do have your GitHub name and I'm searching for your commits, well, any commit with your email, you get the point. There's a lot of ways that your contributions can be lost. But if you're tagging your issues and you're saying, I did this issue, and then I see a commit attached to that issue, done, no question. So beneficial, especially if, it's beneficial, especially if you're actually doing work and contributing to your team in a productive way. If you're not, I don't know, maybe you're trying to get away with something. But that's also going to be crossing my mind. Well, there's no issues, there's no direct links to their commits. Are they trying to get away with something? Are they trying to, pull the wool over my eyes, as they say? So I highly recommend this. That's my quick pitch on that. Don't get some surprise individual grading adjustment because you didn't have good project organization. Track your issues, submit the links, then you don't have to have any question that I know what you did on the project. It helps you in that grading. In the README, just give a quick overview of what your project is. This can be non-technical, but tell me what your idea is. So whatever theme you decide to apply to your site, put that in the README. Is it Facebook for kittens? I don't know. Whatever it ended up being, I always have those go-to examples, the expert for why. But whatever you came up with for your idea, your theming and everything for your app, just put that in the README. Let me and anyone else know what you're trying to do, what you're trying to build, what you're going to build this semester. And the open source reports, this I want to talk about a bit during today's lecture. That'll be one of my big big focus points. I'm sure there are a lot of questions on these open source reports, so I want to clear some of that up. Once I get out of this doc, I'll go into this a little more detail, and we'll talk about it all lecture. But any open source technology, anything that would be banned on the homework assignments that you use for your project has to have a report attached to it. And you need one of those for each technology. So if you pull in a web framework and a templating engine, you gotta have 2 reports, one for each of those, with links to the relevant code that you're specifically using for that app, or for your project. And I'm sure you'll have questions. Please shout out questions, as I'm not gonna know all of the specifics of what you wanna ask questions already.
If I use something like, okay, so if you use React, is that, like, so do you have to make one for React?
Yes, you'd have to make one for React.
Okay, I just sort of,
So like, part one of the project is really just the front end, but like, say we're using like Flask, just bare bones, like templating, does it make sense to do the open source for phase 1, or would it make more sense to do that for phase 2?
When you use it, you have to, so you would have to submit that for phase 1. You'd have to submit the Flash report. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, so then when you submit it for every phase, since you're probably using that technology differently for each phase?
Yep. Yeah, so you'll have some directory reports or whatever you want to call it. Did I specify what I had to do? I did, yeah, reports. I was on the fence whether I was going to specify the directory name or not. Because if I specify, I don't want to go on this tangent, but if I specify the name, I will get teams that don't use that name, and then what do I do? Is that points off because you misspelled something or something? But if I did end up specifying the name, just spell it right so I don't have to make those silly decisions. I probably wouldn't take points off for a course this complex. I'm not going to do that. But anyway, in your reports, so you only have to report on what you use that technology for. So you're using Flask. If you're using Flask for phase 1, you do have to have a report in there for Flask. But if you're only using it to serve your static files, the report just has to say, we're using this to serve static files. Here's the code that serves static files. Done. And then for phase 2, you start doing some more complexity. You start routing and using HTML template, whatever else you're using Flask for. Then you would add that to your report for like phase 2 and phase 3, whatever new features of the library you're using. You would add that.
Are these just TXT files that go in this directory? Or is it the same as the?
I don't think I ever specified the format. So TXT, PDF, RTF, whatever, Markdown, whatever format you have. You could even make them HTML and render as web pages for all I care. But you got to get the information to me in the TA. And Nick, you had a question?
Yeah, just to bounce off the React thing, because React is like obviously like a giant front end thing for each like React library that I pull in, say like React Bootstrap or React Router DOM, each one of those gets its own report too?
As long as you have the information there, I'll leave that undefined. However you see the best way to get that information to me. It's if you use a lot of different sub-libraries of a specific thing. Yeah, I'd say, but whatever features you are using, whatever specific module that came from, that's the code I want to see that you need to show. Yeah, especially if it has dependencies, like in Node especially, in the whole JavaScript ecosystem, there's a lot of really tiny dependencies all around. I'm not going to make you write a report for every single one. Yeah, that would get a little crazy. But if you're pulling 2 libraries together to accomplish one task, I'll say use your best judgment whether it's 1 or 2 reports. In the JavaScript ecosystem, a lot of times that probably will be 1 report. All right, so your actual goal, I've mentioned this quite a few times, I just have more detail here, but the 5 bullet points, I expanded on each one. Each one of these should be visible on your front end. So I should be able to go to that front end and see where each one of these things will exist. You might want to do this with multiple pages, or you might have a single page app, however your design is, but somewhere in your app, all 5 of these things should be present. And I expanded on each one. If you have specific questions about any of these, please let me know. I'm not going to read through all the bullet points in lecture, though. But I just expanded on what I mean. And more so clarified. For example, voting, it doesn't have to be like a thumbs up, thumbs down. It can be any numerical value, like something that represents how many people have taken some action about some post. I don't care if it's liking, upvote, downvote, shares, retweets, whatever it is, just some numerical value. And this value doesn't necessarily, did I put that in here? I was going to, but I figured it would get way wordy. The votes, there's nothing on here that says it has to be displayed either. If you do want to not display the votes, in my opinion, I think social media probably should start going that way. There's a lot of psychological effects with displaying the number of votes and things like that. If you're in that camp and you want to not display the number of votes, but still track the number of votes, you still have to track them, whatever your voting system is. It does not have to be displayed to the general public. Maybe it's only displayed to the user who posted, or maybe it's just displayed on an admin site where no users can see that. But you do have to have some form of just numeric counting how many people clicked some button for each post. And Docker, we'll talk about this Wednesday and Friday, but you do have to deploy with Docker, having a Docker file. Here are the steps that we're going to run, so you can use these same steps to test. Cloning your repo, going into the right directory, building the Docker image, and then running that Docker, running a container based on that image. So make more sense as we start talking about that. And then use port 8000 for these. The video, I haven't really mentioned this in lecture, so let's talk about this just briefly. Submit a video just showing off your app. This is, there are a few uses for this. One, if Nick and myself can't, if there's something wrong with your Docker, but your site's fine, and Nick and I just can't run your Docker image, we can't get your site up and running, well, we at least have the video to get an idea of what's there. We can use that to your advantage. But also just showing off the expected functionality and showing it off to other people. You want to, send an email to your parents and say, hey, look what I built. It's always nice to have that video to be able to share it and explain what you have. What I want to talk about is the length of this video. There's no length requirement at all, no min, no max. I almost put a max of 1 minute, almost put a max of 5 minutes. I decided to do no max. But there's no max, no min, however long it takes you to show off your site. This could happen in 30 seconds, might happen in 10 seconds, might happen in 2 minutes. However long it takes you. Don't pad the runtime just thinking that you need a longer video, but also make sure you hit every point of your video. Don't skip one of those things. I'd recommend just opening your site, have it running, run some screen capture software, and showing each of the 5 bullet points, show where they exist in your app, and then ending the video. You can have a voiceover, it's optional, really flexible on this. Just show your app, show it running, working, and being there. For phase 1, this won't be too difficult. Just run your app and show it off. Once you're showing off actual functionality, these get more involved for phase 2 and phase 3. I'll have similar criteria, if not the exact same criteria. Just make sure you hit all the functionality. Anything that's required for that phase, just make sure you show it up. But they'll be a little longer. It might take longer than 30 seconds for future phases. Yeah.
When you say functionality for phase 1, it's just the front end skeleton pretty much, no?
Yeah, for phase 1 isn't any real functionality.
Just HTML most likely.
Yep. But for phases 2 and 3, there'll be more complex functionality that you're showing off. It'll just naturally take longer to show the video. Phase 1 video is kind of like the homework 1 documentation. I just want to make sure we're all understanding what the submission procedures are. So when the videos do get more complex, you're not going, wait, what screen capture software do I want to use? Let me figure that out, stuff like that.
For any of these phases, is the aesthetic appeal of the site ever taken into account for grading?
No,
And
not for
just
grading.
like
So
formatted HTML and
the aesthetics are not taken into account for grading to some certain extent. If the aesthetics are so bad that I can't even find your 5 bullet point things, those 5 things should be apparent. It should be obvious. So the aesthetics matter just to the degree that it makes the it's clear what the app is supposed to do. Yeah, if, I don't care about like your choice of color, your color palette, or the organization, where is everything on the screen. I hope that you will, I'm hoping that teams will take pride in that and want to put forth a good site, but it's not going to be part of the grading structure, no.
Just in case there's,
Yeah,
I'm sure
get,
that's probably the
yep.
first thing to get cut.
Yep, that's the first thing that should get cut if you have a time crunch. Don't make it pretty. Plus, that's a huge time sink. Just think of from my own experience. Trying to get a site looking the way you want can take forever. Just figuring out, do I want this boundary 1 pixel to the left, 1 pixel to the right? Changing the hex values of RGB colors. Like, what if I increase this by like five more red? Oh my goodness, it can take forever. It can be a real time sink. So yeah, don't get caught in that trap. Get the functionality there.
But it's okay if we use Bootstrap or something like that.
Yeah, but Bootstrap, you would have to submit a report.
Yeah, but it's just a little document saying, this is
Yeah.
Bootstrap, this is what we used it for.
Mhm.
Something like
And submit the form. The form submission, oh, I have to be logged in. You'll just have to imagine. But the form, because I'll get to a fade, I'll get duoed. I would have to open in Chrome where I'm logged in with Duo. But anyway, the form, you'll have to imagine it. It's just 2 links, your GitHub repo link and your YouTube video link, and that's it. We're going to go into your repo, and that's how we're going to do the grading. Everything has to be there in the repo, and if everything's there, checks out, we're going to clone your repo, run Docker. If everything checks out, that's how we're going to do the grading. And watch the video, of course. All right, so you're allowed to use web frameworks, but if you haven't just on your own gone off and done some web developing, you might not know what a web framework is. So let's clear that up and let's talk about this. This new magical tool that you're allowed to use, what even is it? So of course they're banned from homeworks. I feel like I can stop reminding you all of that. You're all very, very aware of this. Banned for homeworks, but now that you get to use them, let's see what these things are. So there's a lot of tasks that we do as web developers and a lot of tasks that you've done on your homework assignments that are very common tasks that any web app needs to take care of, any web developer needs to take care of. And this is what web frameworks are doing for us, is taking those very common tasks, parsing URLs, for example, handling multi-part data. These are things that you're not the first ones to have to solve these questions. So I took away web frameworks. You actually had to solve them yourself. But there are these things called web frameworks which are going to do these things for us. And this is what you should be using outside of this class. The homeworks, I mentioned this before, so I'll just be real brief this time. The homeworks, taking away the web frameworks, it's for educational purposes. I want you to see what those things are doing for you and really understand how web apps work. Instead of just pulling in somebody else's code that somebody else wrote, a web framework that's written by some team of professional engineers, and calling the methods in the framework. It doesn't really get you understanding what a web app is. It just shows you how to use one particular web app. So for educational purposes, taking away the web apps so you can see what a web app really is, what it fundamentally does. So we'll talk about 5 things. I'll talk about these fairly briefly. But these are 5 things that we've done in the homework assignments, or at least we'll do by tonight, that any web framework is going to handle for you in one way or another. Each framework is going to have different syntax and things like that. But these are 5 things that they're going to handle for you. So let's talk about these. So routing paths, you get some requests, and you got to figure out what to do with it. So for example, if somebody punches this in, they're going to get a GET request for the root path. They punch this in, GET request for /blog. And we need to decide where to go with it. This is what we call routing. I haven't really called it by name in the homework, so I just said write a path, name this. That takes GET requests and does that. But when in the web framework world, when you're reading the documentation, we call this routing. Routing is typically done in a lot of the frameworks I've seen by using callbacks or first order functions, whatever terminology you want to use for it, is we say on a specific request type, on a specific path, call this function. And then we have some method to be able to send, return something to the user without having to worry about encoding. Here I'm just giving it a string and the framework takes care of the encodings and everything for me after that. This function, in this specific one, this is express, but every framework is going to have some way of handling this. Express, that function is going to take a request and a response. I get all the information of the request in that request object, and anything I want to send back to the user, I'm going to use that response object. So I have those accessible to me. I can add extra information. I can add headers to the response right here. I can read the headers of the request, read the body of the request. I can read all that information right here. But the routing, whenever somebody sends a GET request to / this code is going to be executed. Bless you. So I left this slide in just, I know most of you haven't taken the new 116. You might not have seen this before, so just in case, I want to make sure. This is what we call a first order function, and this is an anonymous function in this case. So what we can do in programming, which you may or may not have seen, depending on if you took 305, I suppose, is treat functions as values. So I can create a function as a value and pass it as an argument to a method in this case. I have the get method, part of the app object, that takes a string and a function as its parameters. So one of those parameters is a function. And this is the same as having a named function. This is an anonymous function, it has no name. It's the same as having a named function and saying, call this function when I get a GET request at the root path. So a little programming note, if you haven't seen this before, I can pass that function doing the same thing. And yeah, common mistake, if it's your first time doing this, do not use parentheses on your function. If we had server root and then parentheses, that's calling the function and using the return value of that function call as your argument. We don't want that. We want to give the whole function itself as an argument, and then the app object is going to call our function when it gets a request at this path. Now, if you want requests going to different paths, or requests for different paths having different functionality, just change that string. This is where most of us, including me, but most of you, and except a few of you, we're using some functional programming. I love to see it, by the way. It was great. Most of us have this giant if, else if get and slash, do this, else if, something else, get and slash, hello, do this, else if, else if, and then else 404. That's where most of us have that giant if statement. A lot of frameworks, any framework I've seen has some way to get rid of that giant if, and it's going to be typically something like this, using first order functions, or in the Java ecosystem where everything's an object, you don't have these first order functions, you'll have some handlers that are going to handle those requests. Similar to GUIs, I know you've seen at least GUIs in Java, where you have action listeners and event listeners. It's the same idea as that. We have some code that's going to be called when a specific event happens. In Java, you're going to use your listeners or handlers. In Express, Node.js, JavaScript, what we're seeing here, we're going to have these callbacks. And in Python, it's typically the callbacks as well, though we may see some Python code that uses the handlers. But some way to run some code each time, different code each time a request is made for a specific path with a specific request type. Every framework's going to have some way of handling that to be able to route these paths. Sometimes we have paths where we want variables in the path name itself. Typically, we would do this for your images that you're serving. You would do this by if path starts with /image, find that next slash, and then take the next part. extract that, and then that's my file name that I'm going to serve. You're all doing something like that, or have already done something like that in homework 4. This is something else that every framework is going to have some functionality for. In Express, we use this colon, meaning this is some variable, I don't know what else to call that. I'll stick with variables, but some variable named post. So as long as my request starts with /blog/, whatever comes after that next slash is going to be my post of that. So what blog post do I want to look at? And then that, whatever name we give this here, is going to show up in request.params.post. Again, frameworks are going to do this different, but they're going to have some form of regex that's going to extract those variables in your path. So now, instead of writing all that code, starts with /blog, parse this, and then do something else, I just put this colon here and say that's going to change, and I want to get that value, depending on the specific path that was requested. Static files, we typically probably started, maybe you're still doing, oh no, you can't in homework 4. But you start with if request type equals get and path equals javascript.js or whatever, open my file and serve that file. And then and send it with the content type text/JavaScript in that case. A framework is going to let you host these static files in a much simpler way. They're going to let you host an entire directory very easily. Now, one way we could do this with what we saw on the previous slide is if we get a request for static / some file name, serve that file, serve that whole file. But this has those issues that we talked about on the other slides. What if they say /static, something secret, some information that you don't want them to necessarily have? So frameworks are going to offer some way to host an entire directory. In Express, this is the syntax for that. You just say, hey, my directory named public is a static directory. So whenever somebody requests something that doesn't hit any of my other routing, check to see if they requested a file name that's in this directory. If they did, read that file, determine the content type, and send them that file in the response. So Express, you just specify the directory name, and everything in that directory will be hosted. And Express won't let you navigate outside of that directory. So somebody can't get something that's outside this directory. We typically call this either static or public. I tend to lean towards public just to make sure it reminds me this directory is open to the public. Anybody who knows the file names in this directory can access those files. If we're serving that whole directory, everything in there is public to the world. Naming it public just drives that point home. This is a public directory. Query string parsing can get pretty painful. Web Framework's going to handle this for us. It's going to have some way to take this query. I don't even have a question mark in here. There should be a question mark here. So to handle this query, just do all the parsing, do the URL decoding, things like that. And actually want to get to an example of this in Express specifically. So I won't talk about that too much right now. Getting our post requests, we want to get a form upload, get a post request with some information. We either have to URL encode it. In this case, this will be URL encoded in the body of the post response. Or if we want to do some multi-part encoding, you all know by now that that's painful to do all that parsing, and it's easy to get bugs in there. You might get your multi-part parsing code working for homework 4, but then if I say, okay, now do a multi-part form with a file, 2 text fields, and a checkbox, your code might fall apart. It might be specifically just handling one image upload. But again, if we're using frameworks for your project, you should be able to handle, that framework should be able to handle everything. It should be tested by teams of people being able to get every single possible case. And then each framework will have some way just to get this request on the server side and say, give me the username, or give me whatever else. Give me this file if it's a multi-part. Give me this information, and they'll say, here you go. Here it is. It's right there, doing all the parsing for you. HTML templates are typically separate. I'm not aware of a framework that has its own templating engine. They're typically separate from the framework, but the framework will have a way to hook up to one of those templating engines. And some of them even have one of those engines hooked up. The default option is already there, set up for you. But it is usually a separate library, separate dependency, even if it doesn't always seem like that. So we have web HTML templates. We saw what these are. We saw the use of them. So I can skip this, some of these bullet points here. But they'll have some syntax. This is handlebar syntax again. It's my favorite one, so that's just what I end up using. They're all pretty interchangeable, honestly. Handlebar is just the syntax I started getting used to. There's no real reason to use one over the other than preference. I mean, there will be, but for the most part, it's preference, I'll say. So here's my loop. We saw this before. Here's my variable in there. What the framework is going to do for us once we have the template in the proper syntax for the templating engine that we're using, we render that template and give it the values. So here I'm giving it the messages, my messages data structure, give it the messages that I want to send, and then I'm going to get these alerts each as, with these as the text. So you write your template, and then you call some render. Again, syntax will be different in all these. I feel like I should just stop saying that. But there will be some way to say render this template with these values and send those to the template. Everything in between is handled for you. Those template engines, if you don't specify all the values that are needed, you can get 500 errors here. So a lot of web technology, especially front-end web stuff, is going to work as hard as it can for us. It's really going to try to render our stuff and show it on the website. Since this is happening server side, we don't get those protections. If I misspelled messages as with a capital M here, if this were a capital M, or maybe I forgot the S here, or whatever I mistyped just a little bit, that's a 500 error, and the user can't view my page at all. They get nothing. They just get whatever my 500 error message is. Hey, the server crashed. It can't handle your request. So something to be a little careful about. We can get these 500 errors here. There are a lot of different ones. For example, Flask will default to Jinja. So if you just use Flask and say, here's a template and everything, if you go through their tutorials and their documentation, there's going to be showing you Jinja as the templating engine. You can swap that out. You can use a different templating engine, import a different engine, and use that. But at least last time I checked, it defaults to Jinja. Express doesn't have, I don't believe it has any just pre-baked in, like Flask, I believe, has Jinja in its requirements.txt, so it's going to install that for you when you install Flask. Express, I don't believe, has anything by default, but it does encourage Pug. It pushes you towards that engine. But again, you can swap that out. I use Express with handlebars. You can swap out the templating engine at any time, depending on the templates you have. This is important. Frameworks have to support multiple templating engines, because if you're using one framework and one templating engine, and you have all these templates written in that engine, and for whatever reason your team decides you want to switch to this framework over here, you don't also want to have to scrap all your templates. You just go to that other web framework and say, hey, this is the templating engine we use, and then rewrite your web framework code if you're making that kind of a switch. But you don't want to throw out all those templates as well. Especially Pug. Pug doesn't even look like HTML at all. You can't really move that to a different templating engine without completely rewriting it. One reason why I don't really like, keep my opinions out. But yeah, find one that works for you and your team, and go with that one. Whatever syntax you like, whatever you like. And then each web framework usually has some built-in web server that's going to make it live to the code, to the world. This is the parts of your code that are handling the HTTP directly. We didn't talk about TCP, for example, at all in here, or actually parsing the HTTP request. They're all going to have some way of handling that, something built in. These shouldn't really be used. These shouldn't only be used out in the world, I'll say that much, without some more sophisticated web server acting as a proxy server. But they will all have some lightweight server to be able to handle HTTP requests. So you can run your Express apps, you can run your Flask apps, etc. You can run those apps and actually start hosting things without pulling in something like Apache or Nginx, which we'll talk about maybe at some point. But we can always run these using their built-in frameworks. Holy crap, I at least want to get to... Forgot I can't zoom in on this. So we might have to live with some small text, but we only got 2 minutes, so I at least want to go through this. So here's some Express. Here's a quick Express app. It's not too fancy. It's small enough that I can go through it in lecture here. But I'm hosting a public directory. So I have public, which is going to hold some of my static files. I'm pathing. If somebody has a slash, request the root path, I'm going to render the home template with items, with these values, which is this dictionary of data here, which I just hard-coded in here for the sake of example. That's going to render home, which just has an empty div. And with handlebars, I also have a main template where all of my standard code is going to go. Where do I? All my, basically my top level template, and then wherever we see this body, that's where the rest of my code is going to go. This is set up to make an AJAX request once the HTML is downloaded, and then the AJAX will populate items in this specific case. And then some other paths, some posts, my 404, if none of those were hit, etc. The one thing I do want to try to show quickly, maybe I'll just have to show this next time. Yeah, let's just start Wednesday off with this, because I don't have time to do it justice. But I want to show going into the code and actually extracting. What you have to do for your reports, actually finding where the code is in these open source software libraries that does what we want it to do. And I'll go through URL encoding, parsing URL encoded strings in the body for the post request of a form that's URL encoded. Yeah, with that, I'll see everyone Wednesday though.